Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. So today we're gonna start off with a new chapter 5.2 sources of finance. Now in this chapter of course we have discussed all of the sources of finance that are there and how do we classify them, and as well as what are the factors that determine the sources of finance available to a business. So all that in this particular chapter. In today's lecture in particular we are going to talk about classifying these sources of finance, like how can we classify the sources of finance. So basically, there are two methods of classifying sources of finance. It can either be by internal source of finance or external source of finance, or we can also classify them as being short-term source of finance or long-term source of finance. This SOF basically means source of finance. Okay, just in case anyone's wondering about that. So, internal source of finance. What do we mean when we say internal source of finance? It basically means that one that exists within the organization. Well, duh. It is basically internal money raised from businesses' own assets or profits left in the business that is flowed back. Either you flow back the profits that you have made in the business, and that's same thing as your retained earnings. Your retained earnings basically you flow them back. Then those retained earnings will be counted as your internal sources of finance. Now, external source of finance is basically money raised from sources outside the business, of course. So basically injection of funds from individuals, other businesses or financial institutions. So internal is of course one that is from the business's own assets or profits, external from other sources, from individuals, other businesses or financial institutions. So let's keep that in mind. Also, we can classify them as being short-term or long-term source of finance, which we are going to look at right now. So yeah, just two diagrams to explain you about the sources of finance, how each of them are classified. But before that, let's talk about the distinction between short and long-term sources of finance. Now, distinction between external and internal sources of finance is pretty obvious, but what about the distinction between short-term and long-term source of finance? Well, in past papers there has come a good question as well for around I guess 3 to 5 marks as well, or even 7 marks. That what's the explain the distinction between short-term and long-term sources of finance. So it is important to understand this particular distinction. Now, short-term, how much short-term do we mean? Like, what is the basic mathematical terms? What do we mean when we say short-term or long-term? Short-term usually refers to financing that spans a period of less than a year, but could extend according to the type of loans or debts being considered. So when we say short-term financing, it generally means being less than a year, whereas in long-term financing it basically means spans a longer period of time, that is greater than 1 year, and it can go up to 30 years as well. So that's how much long we say when we say long-term financing. Short-term finances includes loans which require a short-term repayment period, probably at a lower interest. So if there's a short-term repayment period, you have to repay it back in a short term. Okay, let's say you have to repay the loan in 6 months perhaps, but the whole idea is that it should be less than a year. It is more risky for long-term financing. Long-term loans will be more risky, so banks often require collateral to prevent default on repayment. So long-term loans, these were short-term loans which had short-term repayment period, but since when we say long-term financing, we will include loans which require a long-term repayment period. So it will have a high interest because it is more risky to offer loans for that much long time. Hence, you all often require collateral for that. That is, you need secured loans. Generally, only secured loans are offered for long terms. Unsecured loans are basically where you don't offer collateral, so they have a higher rate of interest, and generally they are part of your short-term sources of finance. Short-term sources of finance are less risky and hence more easily accessible to small businesses. And however, long-term financing, it is generally restricted to large or established businesses that can supply collateral. So if you have collateral, you can have good loans and payments. And other sources of finance also mean you need to have be a good credible businesses or large businesses to gain access to these long-term sources of finance. Short-term finances also include short-term loans, overdrafts, short-term leases, and accounts payable. All these are short-term sources of finance. We already discussed about loans. Overdrafts are also something similar, but We're going to discuss about overdrafts in much more detail in a separate lecture altogether. Short-term leases are basically when you use assets for a particular period of time for short term, okay, by paying small rentals. And accounts payable is about the credit that is offered, that needs to be offered to your suppliers, basically the money that you have to give to your supplier, that is also your short-term source of finance. How is that? We're going to talk about that later on. So it is used for day-to-day financial requirements or to cover any shortfall between income and expenditure, so that you can maintain your cash flows. Basically, that's what you use short-term financing for. You generally use that to maintain your cash flow, that is maintaining your day-to-day financial expenses. Long-term finances, on the other hand, it is generally restricted to large establishments that we already discussed. It includes issuance of shares, that is your share capital, long-term bank loans, long-term leases, retained earnings, and mortgages. So basically, all these are your long-term sources of finance. When we say retained earnings, perhaps sometimes retained earnings can also be classified as a short-term source of finance, because it's basically because sometimes you might need retained earnings for managing your cash flow, and that's why sometimes it is also classified as short term, but generally it's long term, but you can use it interchangeably as well. And long term finances are basically used for long term investment for large projects, which is all that means it's also used for expansion. So I hope you get the idea, right? What are the main differences between short term and long term sources of finance? Now let's look at what these sources of finance are. First, let's say sources of finance, let's say these can be distributed to internal or external. First, internal sources of finance, in this particular case diagram shows retained profit, sales of assets, and reduction in working capital. Similarly over here as well, internal sources of finance include working capital. So basically when we say working capital, that means reductions in working capital are what counts as a source of finance. How is that? We're going to talk about that in a separate lecture, of course. Today in this lecture we're just classifying these sources of finance. Retained profits, as you can see, it's basically internal source of finance, retained profits, because that is basically a profit that the business makes and it flows it back. It's your own profit, it's not coming from outside or something. Okay, so that's why retained profits are part of internal source of finance. But as you can see, it is also included in short-term sources of finance as well as long-term sources of finance over here. Sorry, this image is a little blurry, but I can't do something about that. Then sale of assets and sale and lease back. Sale of assets, basically you're selling your assets, or sale and lease back is basically when you sell your assets to a company and then lease it back, like use the asset for a particular period by paying small rentals. Okay, so that's the whole idea behind. So these are the basic four internal sources of finance over here: retained profits, reduction in working capital, sale of assets, and sale and lease back is also part of internal source of finance, which is not drawn over here perhaps, but it is part of source of finance. Then we have external sources of finance. Now let's just ignore this long term or short term for now and just look at the external sources of finance. External sources of finance are of course share issue, that is issuance of your shares, debentures, long term loans, and grants grants are basically from government. Then there's leasing, that is when you pay rentals for something, for an asset, to use that asset for a particular time period. Hire purchase is similar thing to leasing, but in hire purchase there's a longer period of time to pay your loans, and the loans are generally maybe higher as well. But in the end, after that whole period ends, you will eventually be the owner. The ownership of that asset will be transferred to you. So that means, like, unlike leasing where you just use that asset, hire purchases when you eventually buy that asset. And there's medium term bank loan. So loans, all kinds of loans are basically, or of course, external sources of finance, but we can also classify them as long term, medium term, or short term. Then bank overdraft, bank loans, creditors, and factoring. Debt factoring basically is your short term source of finance. All this over here as well, you can see. And microfinance, that's also not mentioned over here. So microfinance, crowdfunding, both of these are also part of your external sources of finance, because crowdfunding, you are just getting money from online website. You just post your fundraiser program over there, tell them about your business, and people eventually make small donations over there. Microfinance is basically sometimes these are specifically for new businesses who don't get finance from other sources of finance, like who don't get loans, etc. So that's for them basically. And new partners is also a source of finance, external source of finance, as in you can take in partnership business, particularly you can have new partners and they can invest in the business, so that's how it becomes an external source of finance. Share capital is basically you issue your shares, so you you others buy your shares, and that's how you raise your capital, so that's external as well. Mortgages and debentures are something in itself. Mortgages about buying, you similar to, you know, leasing in hire purchase, in the sense that it's paying rentals and eventually getting that, but it's usually for houses, not for assets or something. It's usually for a place, or which you can say a shop or outlet perhaps. Debentures are basically bonds. Venture capital is special capital, like special investments similar to loans perhaps, but these are offered to riskier projects by special investors who are called venture capitalists. And in exchange for venture capitalists, they generally don't ask much something, but they might ask for like ownership in the new business if it succeeds. And so that's basically all the external source of finance. Overdrafts is also, of course, about, this agreement between bank where you can buy up to an agreed amount whenever you want, whenever you need it. So but it has a high rate of interest if overdrawn. Okay, so we have classified the sources of finance as internal and external. Now about the short term and long term as well, let's just look at this particular area as well. Now when we talk about short term sources of finance, then that's your working capital is basically short term source of finance, the reduction in working capital. Your overdrafts are your short term sources of finance. Small loans, short term loans, and retained profits are also sometimes internal source of finance. Sorry, short term source of finance, we're talking about that. And your creditors and debt factoring as well. Debt factoring is not mentioned over here, but debt factoring is basically those payables that creditors, the payables that you have, sorry, receivables, your trade invoices that you have from your customers, that okay, after a month they will pay you. You can just sell that invoice to a debt factoring or an external company, third party, after which will pay that amount, not the full amount, but something like 80% to 90% of that amount, that sale invoice to you, so that you can have your cash in hand before 1 month. But after 1 month, the customer won't pay to you. Now the customer will instead pay to that company. So that's basically debt factoring. We're going to talk about that in detail, so don't worry if you don't understand it now. And those were short term. And long term, of course, long term can includes medium term and long term, both are classified, basically classified as long term sources of finance. So leasing, hire purchase, and medium term loans, all of these are medium term. And long term is all of these, like bank loans, mortgages, debentures, share capital, having new partners, government grants, crowdfunding, microfinance, venture capital, retained profits as well, and like asset leasing basically. So all of these are your long term sources of finance, because they generally take more than a year. You don't have to pay it back like after 1 year, within 1 year basically. So as we said, that it spans a longer period of time, from 1 to 30 years. So that's why all these are your long term sources of finance. Now don't worry if you don't understand, some of them might be confusing to you, might not be familiar with some of them, but we're going to talk about each of them in detail as we move on through this course. So thanks for watching this lecture, and Allah Hafiz. Hello